Return the 50,000 or don't come home. That was the message on my phone, written by my own mother as if she were a stranger threatening me with eviction, not the woman who raised me. No hello, no explanation, no compassion, just a demand and a condition, cold and sharp like a blade. I remember staring at the screen, my hands trembling, my heart pounding, and realizing with terrifying clarity that I wasn't their daughter anymore, not in the way a daughter should. Beloved, I had become their lifeline, their emergency fund, their safety net they could tap into whenever their bad decisions or reckless spending left them stranded. They didn't see me as family. They saw me as cash flow, and now they wanted to test if I'd still bend under pressure. $50,000. That wasn't pocket change. That was a year of rent, a lifetime of savings for someone like me who had scraped together every penny to build some kind of stability. And for them to throw it at me like an ultimatum, to threaten me with being cut off from home unless I handed it over, it was like they wanted to strip me of the last illusion that I mattered. I could still hear my father's voice in my head. From years ago, whenever I'd resist. Family is family, Claire, and family helps each other. But it was never mutual. Their help was conditional, their support was selective. When my brother needed a car, they took out a loan. When my sister racked up credit card debt, they covered it. But me? I was the responsible one. The one who had to pick up the pieces, the one who was told, "You'll understand when you're older," as they handed me their bills. And now here I was, older, and I understood all too well. They had groomed me to be their insurance policy. That night I didn't sleep. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, remembering every time they had guilted me, every time I had written a check to help out, every time I had been told I was selfish for saying no. The text was just the culmination of a lifetime of being used. But what they didn't know, what they had underestimated, was how much I had changed in silence. I wasn't the scared, obedient daughter they thought I still was. I had been keeping records, saving receipts, documenting transfers. I had been preparing for the day when they'd finally push me too far. And that day had arrived with one single text message. Return the $50,000 or don't come home. They thought I would cave. But this time, I was ready to give them a reason. To mean it, I didn't respond right away. I let their message sit there on my screen, glowing like a warning sign, while I went about my day in silence. I knew the longer I waited, the more anxious they would become, because that was the power shift they never anticipated. Me not reacting. Normally, I'd call, apologize, beg to understand what was happening, and eventually agree to help, just to keep the peace. But this time, instead of panicking, I opened my laptop and pulled up the folder I had created months ago. I had titled it simply, Family Finances. Inside were years of bank transfers, PayPal receipts, Venmo screenshots, and even cash withdrawal notes where my parents had pressured me into spotting them just until next week. Next week usually turned into never. I had everything neatly labeled. Car down payment for Adam, $8,500. Credit card payoff for mom, $4,200. Dad's gambling debt cover, $7,000. Altogether, the total they owed me wasn't $50,000. It was closer to $92,000. And that wasn't even counting the unpaid hours I had spent helping with their family business, the time they called me home to babysit when they didn't want to pay for childcare, or the holidays they guilted me into paying for because they insisted, "You make more money now." Sitting there, scrolling through those receipts, I realized I had built my own case file against them. Proof that for years they had used me like a personal ATM. And now they had the audacity to threaten me if I didn't give more. That night, I didn't cry. I didn't call friends for advice. I didn't drink myself numb. Instead, I drafted an email. In it, I attached every single file from that folder with a spreadsheet summarizing the totals, color-coded by year. I wrote, "You say I owe you $50,000, but according to my records, you owe me $92,000. Consider this my invoice. If you want to discuss repayment, I'll make myself available. Until then, do not contact me unless it's through writing." My finger hovered over the send button for a long moment, my stomach tight and my pulse racing, because I knew once I sent it, everything would change. But then I thought of that text again. Return the $50,000 or don't come home. And I realized home hadn't felt like home for years. So I hit send. And in that moment, the silence that followed was the sweetest revenge I had ever tasted. The first reply didn't come from my mother. It came from my father less than 12 hours later, and it was exactly what I expected. How dare you keep tabs on your own family? What kind of daughter does that? You sound like a stranger. Delete whatever you think you have and let's be reasonable. We need the money now. This isn't the time to hold grudges. I read it. Slowly, every sentence dripping with guilt and manipulation, the same script they had always used. Shame first, urgency second, then a desperate plea disguised as morality. But I didn't delete anything. In fact, I backed it all up twice. Once on a flash drive, once in the cloud. His words didn't sting the way they used to. They only confirmed what I already knew. He wasn't upset about the truth. He was upset that I finally had proof and refused to stay silent. Later that evening, my mother wrote, "Claire, stop this nonsense. Families don't keep receipts. You're embarrassing us. Do you want everyone to know our private matters? You can't put a price on love. Please, just send the money. We'll talk after." It was almost laughable. You can't put a price on love coming from the same people who had literally priced me at $50,000 in a single text? I didn't answer either of them. Instead, I forwarded both of their replies to my own email thread, so the paper trail was complete. Then I sat back and watched the silence stretch. Hours turned into a day into two, and I could almost hear their panic through the lack of messages. For the first time, they were the ones afraid of losing me, not the other way around. And that's when it hit me. Maybe I had already lost them years ago, the moment they decided money mattered more than trust. But now finally, I had the power to close that door myself. On the third day, they escalated. My brother Adam called me from an unknown number, his voice sharp and rehearsed, like he had been sent on an errand. "Claire, Mom and Dad are freaking out." "Why are you doing this? Just send them the 50 grand. You know they'll calm down once they get it. Why make this such a big deal?" His tone made me laugh bitterly, because of course he didn't understand. He had always been on the receiving end of their generosity. The car they bought him, the rent they covered, the little emergencies that magically disappeared when he was in trouble. For him, family was a bottomless well of support. For me, family was an invoice that never got paid. I let him talk, let him use every excuse. "They're older now. They need you. Stop being selfish." Until he ran out of breath. Then I said calmly, "Adam, tell Mom and Dad I don't owe them a dime. Tell them they owe me $92,000. I sent the proof. If you want to argue with numbers, be my guest. Otherwise, lose my number too." And I hung up before he could answer. The silence that followed was different this time. Not the silence of fear, but the silence of freedom. I went for a walk that evening, down streets I had walked 1,000 times, only this time I felt lighter, like invisible chains had finally broken. No buzzing phone in my pocket, no dread of the next guilt-laced voicemail, just me and the knowledge that I'd finally stood up for myself. Of course, I wasn't naive. I knew they wouldn't just stop. My parents had built their lives on appearances, on keeping the family name spotless in public while rotting it from the inside. If word got out that their own daughter was demanding repayment, that they had bled me dry, their reputation in the neighborhood, at church, among their friends, it would crumble. And so I prepared myself. I printed copies of the records. I shared the folder with my lawyer friend from college, just in case anything happened. I even drafted a statement I could release if they tried to smear me. For once, I wasn't playing defense. I was ready, and sure enough, 2 days later, the real storm began. My aunt messaged me on Facebook with a pointed line. "Your parents are heartbroken. Why would you do this to them after everything they've done for you?" That was the moment I knew my parents had gone public with their version of the story, painting me as the ungrateful, greedy daughter, the one who turned her back on her family for money. What they didn't know was that I had every intention of letting the truth out if they kept pressing. They thought they were exposing me, but they had no idea I had been waiting for years to expose them. By the time the whispers reached me through cousins and old neighbors, the story had already twisted into something grotesque. Apparently, according to my parents, I had embezzled money from them. I had taken advantage of their kindness. I had betrayed the very people who gave me everything. It was surreal, hearing myself cast as the villain when all I had done was finally close the faucet they had been draining for years. But instead of breaking me, their lies gave me the push I needed. I gathered everything: the spreadsheets, the receipts, the transfers, even the late-night texts where my mother begged for just one more loan. I compiled it into a single PDF, neat and professional, titled Family Debts, Claire Morgan Records. Then, without hesitation, I sent it to every relative who had reached out to lecture me. Every aunt, every uncle, every cousin. No explanations, no dramatic defense, just the raw, undeniable math. At first, the silence was deafening. A full day went by with no responses, and I thought maybe they'd all chosen to side with my parents blindly. But then, slowly, the cracks appeared. My cousin Jenna messaged me privately. "Claire, I had no idea. They always made it sound like you were so lucky that you owed them. I'm sorry." Another cousin, someone I hadn't spoken to in years, admitted, "They tried to borrow from me too. Smaller amounts, but still, I thought it was just me." Piece by piece, the perfect image my parents had built began to unravel. Their golden reputation was bleeding out, and they had no one to blame but themselves. That weekend, my father tried one last desperate move. He showed up at my apartment, unannounced, pounding on the door until my neighbors peeked out. When I finally opened it, he shoved a crumpled piece of paper into my hands. "You think this makes you strong? You think this is family? You're destroying us," he hissed, his face red with rage. The paper was a handwritten note. "You are disowned until you return what you stole." For a second, I almost laughed. Stole? I had records proving the opposite. But looking into his furious eyes, I realized the truth. They would never admit what they had done, because admitting it would mean acknowledging that I had value beyond my bank account. And so, I folded the paper neatly, slipped it back into his hands, and said the only words I had left for him: "Then mean it. Don't come back." After that confrontation, I expected the silence to settle permanently, but I underestimated just how desperate my parents could become when control slipped through their fingers. Within a week, I got a letter in the mail, not handwritten, but typed, official-looking, with their lawyer's letterhead at the top. It accused me of defamation of character, threatened to sue if I continued spreading false accusations, and demanded immediate repayment of $50,000 to avoid escalation. I sat at my kitchen table with that letter in my hands, and for the first time in my life, I smiled reading something they had sent me. They thought a lawyer's letter would scare me back into obedience. What they didn't know was that I had already shared my records with my friend Lisa, the one who had gone into corporate law, and she had helped me organize everything precisely for this reason. I called her, read the letter aloud, and she laughed so hard she nearly dropped her coffee. "Claire, this is bluff. If they drag this to court, discovery will tear them apart. You have evidence. They don't. If anything, you could countersue for fraud and emotional damages. Trust me, they won't risk it." For the first time in years, I felt protected, not just by a friend, but by the truth. I wasn't the scared little girl anymore, cornered by guilt trips and ultimatums. I was an adult with facts on my side. So I wrote a short reply through Lisa, carefully worded and polite. "All claims are baseless. Documentation of financial transfers is available and will be presented in full if necessary. Further harassment will be addressed legally." That was it. No emotions, no apologies, just facts. When I dropped the envelope in the mailbox, a calmness settled over me that I hadn't known I was capable of. Because this wasn't just about money anymore. This was about rewriting the story they had forced me into. The obedient daughter, the financial scapegoat, the one too weak to push back. And as much as they hated it, the story had already changed. My parents weren't my keepers anymore. They were my creditors, and for once, they were the ones who couldn't afford the debt. The fallout spread faster than I expected. Within 2 weeks, the very same relatives who had once wagged their fingers at me began whispering a different story. Not the one my parents had tried to script, but the one my documents had laid bare. At a family barbecue that I, of course, didn't attend, my aunt slipped and mentioned the word ledger, and suddenly everyone realized my parents weren't victims at all. They were borrowers who had burned through not just their savings, but their own daughter's future. My parents called me in a panic that night, alternating between rage and begging. Claire, you've humiliated us. People are asking questions. Your uncle won't even lend us money anymore. Do you see what you've done? My mother's voice cracked as if she expected pity, but all I heard was confirmation. Their real loss wasn't me, it was their supply. Their well had finally run dry. I stayed quiet on the phone for a long moment, letting the weight of their words hang, and then I said calmly, "You told me not to come home unless I gave you $50,000. I didn't. So believe your own words. I'm not coming home. Ever." The silence on the other end was colder than anything I had ever felt, and then the line went dead. From that point forward, the shift was irreversible. Neighbors they once impressed with charity events now crossed the street when they saw them. Friends who used to praise their generosity began to distance themselves when they realized the truth. Even my siblings, who had always benefited from their selective favoritism, started to resent the chaos that was spilling into their lives. Adam called again weeks later, this time quieter, defeated. "Claire, they're losing everything. I don't know what to do." And for the first time, I didn't feel guilty. I didn't feel responsible. I felt free. Because their downfall wasn't my revenge. It was just the natural consequence of years of choices finally catching up to them. And for once, I wasn't the one paying the price. Months passed, and what began as family drama evolved into something bigger, something that stripped away the last illusions I had about where I came from. My parents had always prided themselves on being pillars of the community. The couple who organized fundraisers, who sat in the front pew at church, who made grand speeches about family values at every gathering. But reputations are fragile, when built on borrowed money and lies. Once the first cracks appeared, everything caved in quickly. Their credit was shot, their friends withdrew, and whispers turned into open conversations. My father lost his part-time consulting gig when his employer discovered his family troubles weren't just rumors, but financial messes splashed across social circles. My mother, once adored for her charity work, found herself quietly pushed out of committees when donors realized she had been funneling money not into causes, but into covering personal debts. And through it all, they still blamed me. In their story, I was the traitor, the ungrateful child who exposed them instead of protecting them. They couldn't admit that their empire had rotted long before I ever stood up for myself. But here's the thing. I didn't need them to admit it. I didn't need their apology, their recognition, or their understanding anymore. I had built my own life away from them, piece by piece, with boundaries as my foundation. I moved to a new apartment across town, one they didn't know the address of, filled it with things I chose, things I paid for, things that felt like mine because they weren't tied to their strings. I started therapy, where I finally said out loud what I had kept buried for years, that being their daughter had felt like being a debt collector, not a child, that I had been taught my worth was measured in how quickly I could bail them out, that I had never been loved without conditions. And week by week, I learned to unhook myself from that narrative. I stopped introducing myself as the responsible one. I stopped minimizing what they had done. I started dating again, carefully, not because I needed someone to save me, but because for the first time, I trusted myself not to lose my identity in someone else's needs. And yet, there was still one last tether. One last thing I had to do before I could close this chapter forever. Because despite everything, a small part of me wanted to leave no room for them to come back, no cracks they could slip through when the next crisis inevitably arrived. I had spent my whole life keeping records for their sake. Now, it was time to keep one final record for mine. So, I did what they never imagined I would. I turned their own ultimatum into a boundary carved in stone. With my lawyer friend's help, I filed a formal no-contact order, attaching the evidence of harassment, the financial records, and even the fake legal threats they had sent. It wasn't just about money anymore. It was about creating a paper wall between me and them that could not be crossed without consequence. When the notice was served, I didn't feel triumph. I felt release. The weight that had lived on my chest for nearly 3 decades finally lifted, replaced by something I barely recognized. Peace. Word spread quickly through the family, as it always did, and people tried to take sides. But I no longer cared. I had the receipts, I had the proof. But most importantly, I had myself. My parents, once so loud, went quiet. Their silence wasn't power this time, it was defeat. They had disowned me in rage, and I had agreed, on my own terms. Months later, when I stood in my new apartment, surrounded by furniture I had picked, books I had bought, and a life that was entirely mine, I realized the real revenge was not in exposing them, not in watching their reputation collapse, not even in cutting them off financially. The real revenge was in the fact that I had survived them, and I was thriving without them. They demanded, return the $50,000 or don't come home. I didn't return a cent, and I didn't come home. Instead, I built a home of my own, one they would never set foot in, one where their shadows couldn't reach me. Family, I finally understood, isn't defined by blood when blood bleeds you dry. Family is defined by safety, by love without price tags, by people who see you as a person, not as a bank. And as I closed the door behind me that night, with no fear of them pounding on it again, I whispered to myself the truth they never wanted me to discover. I was never their debtor. They were mine. And the account had been closed forever.